Orpheus. He played and stone did weep. The river bowed, its voice was hushed, its currents held their breath. The dead stood listening, mute within their shroud, and time itself lay trembling, still as death. Then Hades spoke, "Thy song has moved the shade, and love so pure that it may bridge the black abyss. Go forth, but know, as I have always known, that man may not endure such terms as these." Through halls of dark and hollow his foot did tread, where breath was thin, where even thought grew pale. His hands grew weak, and his heart began to fill with dread. His step grew slow, his courage stretched frail. His courage turned, and so did he. Too soon, a step too soon, and silence met his cry. The lyre did fall, the dust did not reply. No second plea would stir the distant throne. And he walked back out, one step back out, and he walked out alone. When Orpheus played, the world held its breath. The very stones wept and rivers became still. Even the god of death himself bent an ear. The poet-musician descended into the underworld, armed with nothing but a song. And for a moment, it was enough. It seemed enough. Love, art, and divine talent had triumphed over death. But then one glance, one moment of doubt, and Eurydice was gone forever. This is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, one of the most enduring myths of love, loss, and the power of art. It's a tale that echoes throughout centuries, still haunting and still unresolved. And one perfectly captured in the poem that I've just read to you, composed by myself. So let's break it down. Orpheus was the greatest musician in the ancient world, according to this myth, and he was in love with Eurydice. But their love was doomed. On their wedding day, Eurydice was bitten by a serpent and died. Stricken with grief, Orpheus decided to do the impossible. He ventured into the land of the dead and tried to bring her back. He made a deal with Hades, and Hades offered him a Faustian bargain, if you will. His music was so powerful that even the gods of the underworld couldn't resist it, and it won him this deal. Eurydice could follow him back into the land of the living, but there was one condition. He could not look back until they had both fully returned. He couldn't look back at her. It was a simple rule, and yet my poem tells us his hands grew weak and his heart begins to dread. His step grew slow as his courage stretched frail. Doubt crept in. Was she truly there? Was it all a cruel trick? His courage wavered and he turned. Too soon, a step too soon, and silence met his cry. She was right behind him, but her footsteps were too quiet. She was lost forever, and he walked back out alone. Orpheus is the ultimate artist. His music literally bends the laws of nature, and yet he's bound by human weakness. This is the paradox at the heart of the myth. His art has immense power, but it's not limitless. His music moved Hades enough, but not enough to save Eurydice. In the end, Orpheus's flaw wasn't a lack of skill, and it wasn't arrogance, and it wasn't greed. It was doubt and fear, and the fragility of human resolve. My poem captures this beautifully. I know I'm patting myself on the back here, but let's move past that. Hades then spoke. Thy song has moved the shade, and love so pure that may bridge the black abyss. Go forth, but know, as I have always known, that man may not endure such terms as these. Even the gods knew that Orpheus was doomed from the start, that his faith would falter, and that his skill alone could not change fate. At its core, I believe that Orpheus' mistake was born out of love. He could not bear the uncertainty. The idea that Eurydice might not be there was unbearable. Maybe she would have fallen, maybe she was taken and he was tricked. And so he turns. We see the same impulse in real life. How often do we sabotage ourselves because we cannot sit with uncertainty? How many times does fear push us to act before we should, or in ways that we should never have done? Orpheus is a classic tragic figure, gifted, noble, but doomed by that single flaw. His flaw wasn't arrogance or pride or greed, like I've talked about in the past. It's something far more relatable and far easier to diagnose with yourself. The inability to trust, doubt. And that's why his story still resonates. Because really, who among us wouldn't have turned around? Genuinely. Orpheus' story endures because it speaks to something that every single person can relate to. The battle between faith and fear, and the pain of irreversible loss. And this poem captures all of it. The eerie silence at the end, the finality of Orpheus' mistake. It lingers, just like the myth itself. Maybe that's why we could tell this story over and over and over again. Maybe in some way, we're all trying to answer the same question. Could we have done better? Maybe the real tragedy of Orpheus' story isn't that he just lost Eurydice. Maybe it's that we all know that deep down, we would have lost her too. Thank you, and see ya, Space Cowboy.